Welcome back to the Inside Java podcast,
where we talk about all things Java by interviewing folks who work directly on the Java platform. Today, we're talking about a very important subject with respect to how the Java platform is developed and released, known as JEP 12, the preview system, and a recent informational JEP that reinforced and expanded on JEP 12, as well as ways that you, the community, can get involved with the development of the Java platform. My guest today is Alex Buckley. Alex has been working on Java for almost his entire career, and his depth of knowledge never ceases to amaze me. So let's jump right in. I don't know if you remember this, but when I first met you about 4 years ago, I walked into your office, and before I was barely seated, you dropped a loud book onto the table, which I presume was the Java 8 JVM specification book with your name on the front. And you loudly proclaimed, "That's my name on the front of the book." And I thought to myself, what am I getting into? But I quickly realized that you were not saying that out of pride, not saying that out of boasting, but you were really saying that out of a sense of loyalty and a responsibility that sometimes comes at the face of harsh criticism. Stewarding a platform forward that probably a majority of the world's economy runs on. First of all, I want to thank you for that job, because I'm sure it's often a thankless job. And I've seen some of that criticism now firsthand. So why don't you start by introducing yourself and telling us about that feeling of, or that role of being a steward of the Java platform?
Thank you, Chad. So yes, my name is Alex Buckley. I've worked on Java since 2006. I'm the spec lead for the Java language and Java virtual machine, which means the specifications of the language and the virtual machine are something that I and others, we have a team here at Oracle, work on to maintain, which is to say, define the meaning of the Java platform independently of any implementation. Obviously, Oracle has the JDK. All the source code for that is in OpenJDK. Many people contribute to that source code. They are implementing a Java compiler, implementing a Java virtual machine, and of course all the libraries. But the definition of what the Java language is independent of all of those implementations. And for over 25 years now, the entire Java ecosystem has prospered from having an absolute belief and commitment in a specification that defines how the thing should work, distinct from any particular code base implementation you happen to download today. There is a single source of truth for everything in the Java platform. And stewardship means as we add new features to the Java platform, we never let up in terms of that commitment. Even if a new feature, whether it takes 1 year to develop, 5 years to develop, 10 years to develop, our goal is always that, first of all, once it's in the platform, it looks like it has always been in the platform. And once it's in the platform, you can go and read, to your heart's content about what it is, how it is, why it is, what it isn't. Because with millions and millions of developers using the Java platform, all possible questions and thoughts exist about old and new features. So for us to be able to express very consistently and completely and authoritatively what the features are, what their boundaries are, what they don't do, in a way that works across all implementations for the rest of time is a responsibility we take very seriously.
5 years ago, we started down this path of 6-month release cadence. Around the same time, we introduced JEP 12, which was preview features. So talk to us about JEP 12 and the introduction of preview features. And in general, what does it mean to be a preview feature?
Yes, so let me just do some acronym expansion to begin with. So a JEP is a JDK enhancement proposal. All new features in Java since 2017 have had a JEP to motivate them, describe them, give goals, give non-goals, delineate the risks and assumptions that are present in a new feature of the Java language, the VM, or the libraries, or actually even the tools, actually. So JEPs are how we communicate our intent for a new feature. The vast majority of JEPs are feature JEPs. They describe, pattern matching in switch, or sealed classes, or a new class in java.star. There are then also some informational JEPs. JEP 12 is one of them, that are kind of meta topics that say, here is how OpenJDK as a whole will think about developing a new feature. So, for example, JEP 3 is the release process for JDK. JEP 12 preview features, yes, as you say, introduced in 2018. It makes the following observation, which is that when we're developing, traditionally speaking, when we're developing a feature, it's done in public, right? The mailing lists have been open for many, many years now. And typically, there are even binaries offered for major new features: Loom, Valhalla, Amber, Panama, these OpenJDK projects that run for years and years and just have this, so much technical investment into them. They offer early access binaries. The trouble is, hardly anyone downloads and uses them. This has been true going back 2 decades. The thing then is, the moment that a feature ships in a generally available JDK release and it unleashed onto the world, everybody tries it. It's headline news in many technical publications, and then everybody has feedback. But by then it's too late because the feature is final. It's crazy. And so we realized a few years ago that we could take advantage of the 6-month release cadence to do this, to say, after all of the years of thinking about and prototyping and designing and implementing a feature, we target it to some JDK release. But just one moment before we commit to it being final and permanent and unchanging for the rest of time, let's just take a minute, 6 months, 12 months perhaps, to put it into a preview state. And the preview state means it is an extremely high quality feature. It has all of the quality characteristics of a final and permanent feature. And yet it's in a state where we can make changes if necessary. The trade-off for this is, because it may change in response to user feedback, and we're very, very clear when a feature goes into a JDK release, whether it's preview or final, because it can change in response to feedback, it is disabled in the preview state by default. So if there's some JDK release and it has a preview feature in it, that preview feature has been worked very significantly. There's a spec for it. There are almost certainly multiple implementations of it. There are test kits. It's had feedback. It's been presented on at user groups and conferences. And yet, just one thing, it's not yet fully final. It may change. And so it's disabled by default. You have to actively opt in at compile time and runtime to using it. And when you do that and you try it out, we seek your feedback kind of one final time in order to really perfect it when, in the next release or maybe the release after that, it goes final and permanent and basically no more changes. That's the idea of a preview feature. It's something in the Java platform, in the Java language or the Java VM or the java.star API, that once it's done, it's done, right? We don't make incompatible changes in the Java language or the java.star API. So once it's done, that'll be it. But for a limited period before it goes final, it's in preview, and based on user feedback, and perhaps its use inside the JDK even, we can make some changes.
So fast forward to 2023. We've seen the first communication by way of a JEP draft that is expanding, or at least further defining, the notion of preview features. So we have JEP draft 8300604, and that was recently updated and created in just back in January. So why don't we talk about that draft? First of all, it's a draft. Is there a plan for it to become a full JEP? Is an addendum to JEP 12? And tell us what what the intent of that JEP draft was to put out there into the wild.
When we first did preview features, they were something that could be in the Java language or in the JVM. Now, we actually haven't had any preview features in the JVM yet. That's going to be coming from Project Valhalla in the future. Let's just set that aside. But we've certainly had a whole load of language features that previewed for a couple of releases and then went final. Text blocks, sealed classes, record classes, some of the first pattern matching functionality was all in preview and is now final in the latest JDK releases. And over time, we realized we needed the ability to preview APIs as well. So in Java 19, we saw the first example of that, both with virtual threads previewed in Java 19, that's an API, and the foreign function and memory API previewed in Java 19. That's, it's fantastic. It is so rich. It's what Jay and I never even dreamed it could be. So we've had a couple of previews of those APIs now, and we've learned a few things. And part of stewardship is incorporating new knowledge into your working practices and your sort of your meta practices. One thing we saw is APIs have a tremendously larger surface area than language features. A language feature is very often, it's maybe even zero syntax or perhaps one keyword, right? And there's a whole deep semantic story under that keyword that has to relate to the rest of the language. But the surface area is pretty small. Versus with APIs, I like to say the map is the territory. If you browse the Java doc of an API, you're not just reading class and method names, you're reading the concepts. You're reading the main things you need to know. And then, of course, the class has the same name as that concept. And of course, the method is called that. And there are dozens or hundreds of methods across dozens of classes, maybe multiple packages. It's a big surface area. And what we had found with APIs is it was possible to preview an API of very, very high quality, get feedback on it. People would play with it, especially with virtual threads. Fantastic levels of interest. And the concepts of the API are solid. But with all of this surface area, we want to tweak some, I shouldn't say corner case, but some method down in some class, over in some package that's perhaps little used, and yet there was feedback about it because we get feedback on everything. And so we started thinking, given that preview APIs with this large surface area, there's so much more we can take feedback on. It's maybe kind of legitimate to say they need perhaps a longer preview period to really polish everything up properly than a language feature. Our language features have previewed pretty well in 2 releases and then done final. But APIs such as foreign function and memory, maybe one, who knows if they're, remember, APIs can be very deeply integrated into the VM. That's not true for language features, right? But a low-level system API like foreign function and memory or virtual threads has deep ties into the Java runtime. And the engineering complexity is it's to the moon, frankly. And so maybe 1 or 2 more previews is legitimate to be absolutely sure for the rest of time that it's worth being final, being enabled by default. And so what this JEP draft you talk about says is basically that, because they're so sort of physically large, and because you can add a new class to an API later in a way that you can't add a new meaning to a keyword later, frankly, in the language. Because of this sort of qualitative difference between language features and APIs, some of the expectations we had built up around preview language features may not apply to preview APIs. Maybe it's okay to take 18 months of preview, right? Maybe it's okay, as long as your concepts in the API are stable, to rename a class. Renaming a class, right, changes all of the code that has been trying to use the feature. Any library that's been built on top of it now has to change. But it's being renamed based on feedback and, sort of a second or third look at the feature. The concept hasn't changed. The name has changed. The class name has changed. The method name has changed. And so perhaps we can say that the preview API is extremely high quality. It's ready to preview 1, 2, maybe 3 times, even if there are going to be kind of surface level changes. That doesn't mean it's not done. Now, how do we communicate everything I've just said to the entire OpenJDK community? You can write a mail to the JDK dev mailing list where all of the news about the JDK project and OpenJDK lives. But frankly, big kind of meta announcements there would get lost. And so we decided to write up this regime for preview APIs, this policy, in the form of an informational JEP. So it's easy to link to, and then integrate its story back into JEP 12, which has now been done. Informational JEPs follow a slightly different process than feature JEPs. Informational JEPs are never really finished. They don't ship. It's not a feature that ships in a JDK release. And so when new information, new environment comes along, it's legitimate to update an informational JEP, as we have now done with JEP 12, to incorporate this slightly new thinking on the readiness of preview APIs.
Right. So did you just say that JEP 12 has been updated to bring in some of this new thinking, or that's the plan?
It has been updated. So for example, in JEP 12, we talk about a preview feature is something whose design and specification implementation are complete, but would benefit from a period of broad exposure before either going final and permanent or being changed. And we always said that although the design and spec and implementation are complete, I'm kind of putting air quotes around complete, we never meant 100% finished. Because if we'd said 100% finished, there's no point taking feedback. There's no point making small course corrections. And that was the whole point of preview features. We always said 100% finished within 12 months. We're now saying a high probability of being 100% finished within 12 months. Because, like I say, for APIs that engage very deeply with the Java runtime, you may need 18 months. And something else we've seen on the language side is where you do a major new language regime, which is pattern matching that's coming to Java. And it's delivered over a number of, it has features, they have sub-features, and you split them up into individual JEPs that target individual releases. You end up with kind of this family of preview features in the language all running simultaneously, all of which have to interact perfectly for a developer experience. And so I think in Java 20, we have a situation where pattern matching for switch is on its fourth preview. And that's not because we don't know how to do pattern matching for switch. It's because there is another part of pattern matching, which is record patterns, which is only on its second preview. And record patterns need to merge into pattern matching for switch perfectly. And one day, all of these things will be declared final, and it'll be fantastic. People will say, what took you guys so long? But on the way to that, we have to kind of let everything come in by parts. So we have a second preview for that part of the feature. The fourth preview of this other part is kind of waiting for the thing that's still only in second preview. It's quite. This is all public, right? Nothing secret here. You can read the docs for why these features have these previews. Keeping it straight in our heads is a little tricky sometimes, but that's the point. That some features, they rely on other features, and you have to not hold the train exactly, but you have to make sure they're integrated with each other properly, because that is 1,000% the expectation of every Java developer when they start programming in Java.
Will we be continuing to take advantage of the notion of experimental VM features?
Because the JVM it's a bit like an iceberg, right? The 10% above the surface it's a virtual machine that takes class files and runs them perhaps through an interpreter. That's all very kind of conceptually straightforward. But then the 90% of the iceberg underneath the water is the amazing engineering complexity of the hotspot Java virtual machine. Multiple JIT compilers, multiple garbage collectors, That's what make your Java program fast. And because there has been so much engineering kind of under the waterline for the past 25 years, the VM team has long had the idea of experimental VM features, which pertain not to the abstract JVM, but to the engineering, the implementation of, say, garbage collectors. So, for example, when the ZGC garbage collector first appeared some years ago, it was labeled as an experimental feature. It's an implementation detail, ultimately, garbage collectors. Technically, a Java program doesn't need a garbage collector. That experimental feature is off by default. There's no guarantee it behaves the same. There's no spec for it, right? It's a garbage collector. It may behave differently from one release or one vendor to the next. And this experimental VM options sort of meta feature, it's been around for many, many years. We have not yet seen a preview VM feature where a concept is so deeply represented in the Java platform that it gets new bytecodes, new representations in the class file. That's coming with Project Valhalla. We haven't seen that yet. Whereas on the other hand, we have seen a lot of experimental VM features. Maybe the experimental VM features will kind of be reaching a productized state, a final state in the future. No guarantees. It's all implementation specific. So yes, let me strongly distinguish experimental VM features from preview features.
So coming back to preview features, what type of feedback are we looking for, and how does the community provide this?
Every JEP lists at the top a mailing list which discusses the feature. Amber Dev, Loom Dev, Valhalla Dev, Panama Dev, JDK Dev, Core Libs Dev. These are OpenJDK mailing lists. And what a lot of people don't realize is if you've tried out a feature, you've gone into your IDE, you've enabled preview features, you've just typed in the sample code from the JEP. Even if you had a kind of a completely unremarkable experience, if everything just worked, tell us that. Subscribe to AmberDev and say, I just downloaded JDK 1902 or JDK 2001, and I tried out so-and-so a preview feature, and it worked. I maybe even tried refactoring some of my pre-existing code to use it, and it worked great. Or it didn't work great because the compiler crashed. That we definitely want to know about. Or it did work great, but I was kind of surprised that I had to write case null here, and I don't really understand that. Because if you don't understand it, you can guarantee 100,000 other Java developers won't understand it when they come into contact with it a couple of years down the line. And so it's then, if we know about that misunderstanding, confusion, we can incorporate a better rationale into our JEP, into release notes, into tutorials, into public presentations where we socialize what the feature is. And so any and all feedback is wanted and desirable and useful, even if it seems to you like it's just a kind of a Me Too thing. It really isn't.
Other than mailing lists, what other places can developers go to learn more about preview features and ways that they can get involved?
Right. The nature of all of these features is, at the end of the day, they're code in Java C or Hotspot or some Java core classes. Some people like to start there. They like to just browse the implementation, and that's fine. Other people will read the JEP, but even beyond that, we typically publish, where there are these big new features, we typically publish kind of roadmap documents. That's probably the place to get started. Between the JEP and, it depends on the feature. Sometimes the JEP is enough. Sealed classes, text blocks, for example, these sort of smaller language features, which perhaps I often say, once you read the JEP, you say, yes, of course it should be like this. Where there's a bigger feature, so many of the Amber features speak to a data-oriented programming style. The best place to get started there is probably not even the mailing list, not even the JEP. It's InfoQ articles, it's long-form roadmap documents by Brian Getz on the Project Amber page. And once you've got all of that programming model, because these are not small features, they might look syntactically sort of small extensions, but we saw with lambdas in Java 8, lambda expression is this tiny little piece of syntax, right? It's some curly braces and an arrow. The arrow is the only new bit, really. And yet in conjunction with the libraries and a whole bunch of type inference in the language, and by the way, you can now add methods to interfaces, default methods, in a compatible way, it just pushes the Java programming experience forward by thousands of miles in one leap. And pattern matching, data-oriented programming is the same thing. So we try really hard to explain all of that story in long-form narrative documents so that when you download the feature, you start playing with a preview feature, you have some idea. There aren't really any tutorials or books written about these features yet. They will come, but you have to kind of rely on the JEP and the long-form narratives. Once you've done that, it's completely legitimate to subscribe to AmberDev and say, hi, first-time poster here. We see this every day, almost every day. The names of people contributing to AmberDev today are different than the names yesterday. They're names we didn't know, and they say, I tried this out, and I'm wondering why this. There are quite a few people here at Oracle working on Java, but it's a 0.00000 kind of percentage compared to all of the Java programmers who will eventually use these features, especially in the language. I hear what you say about the mailing lists can be intimidating, especially, I look at something like core libsdev, where all of the Java libraries, essentially all of the Java library evolution and maintenance happens, and I'm terrified by it, right? It's like a megabyte of mail every month. I think luckily for the kinds of features we're talking about here, AmberDev is a lot more kind of understandable. Panama Dev, a foreign function and memory interface. LoomDev, the virtual threads. I look on Panama Dev from time to time, and I see people I've never met, will never meet. Maybe they're contributing this month, and they'll move on to something else. Sending feedback, asking questions, getting answers from Maurizio Cimadamore, the project lead. Direct answers, leading to bug fixes, leading to clarifications in the Java doc, leading to that surface area of the API being polished up just a little more in that corner, because, like I say, once it's final and it's out there and we largely move on to work on yet more new features, almost no level of perfection is too high for what ships in the Java platform for the next 30 years.
This seems like a pretty good place to plug inside.java, where we on the DevRel team try our best to synthesize the signal from the noise, and then we take that signal and we aggregate all of that content into one single place. So anything that the Java team, content that they create, whether it's a presentation at a conference, a podcast that they do like this one, or even an entry on one of the mailing lists, we find that signal and we aggregate it in one place and make it easily discoverable, whether it's by author or by tag, like, searching for GC or searching for Loom. You can find all of that information in one place. So, Alex, we've been talking about the preview system. It's been around for about 5 years, but the ecosystem's been around for a lot longer. I mean, we're talking 20 plus years here. How has the adoption of the preview system been into the many libraries and frameworks that have been around for a long time?
So Java 20 is like I say, probably out as you hear this. Virtual threads are in their second preview. That's looking pretty good to be a final feature real soon now. We have been so gratified by the reaction and interest from all kinds of developers, but especially from the library developers working on Spring Boot, Quarkus, Jetty, Tomcat, Helidon. Because if they adopt new preview APIs in their frameworks, it may very well be the case that Java developers can benefit from those new preview features that eventually go final with no work at all. Because the right layer of the Java ecosystem was kind of in tune with the layer below it, the platform. And that means the entire Java ecosystem moves forward very, very smoothly. You just get a new version of your preferred server-side framework, and it automatically takes advantage, perhaps, of the new features in JDK-N. You don't need to recode anything. You don't need to change your annotations. You just upgrade your runtime and your tools, and you get a much better, maybe it's a faster execution, a faster startup. Maybe it's a better programming model. If you want to opt into that, that's up to the frameworks. I've always thought that's what winning looks like, moving the entire Java ecosystem forwards by carefully setting expectations with the stakeholders and the users who matter about what is coming. And that's what preview is really all about.
Well, we end every podcast with one simple question. Feel free to answer it however you want. Why don't you tell us about a day in the life of Alex Buckley?
That's a really on-the-spot kind of question. I have fingers in a lot of pies. I mentioned before we have a great team working on designing, implementing, specifying the new language features and new VM features. And my role these days is largely reviewing all of that work. I have some many years of experience now in the precise and accurate style in which we deliver specifications, in particular the specifications for these features that, of course, most Java developers don't read, but they're there underpinning all the tools and libraries you use. And so making sure that new specifications, new JEPs are complete and consistent, not missing anything out, because sometimes we get a little blind to, we're doing a feature this way, and I say, yeah, but I guarantee someone's going to ask, why can't I write this code? Because when you're writing Java code, infinite programs are possible. And so I have a pretty broad view now of what's going into the Java platform and trying to stop bad things happening. I have so many colleagues who make wonderful things happen, but it's good to sometimes kind of have an independent, almost eye that says, wait a minute, let's not do that. And having, frankly, the power to make those changes if necessary.
Yeah, in a way, it's like you and Dr. Deprecator work closely together.
I sometimes call myself Professor Preview, my colleague, Dr. Deprecator, Stuart Marks, because stewarding the Java platform isn't just about, do we have completeness checks on the code. There's a bunch of kind of high-level principles that we need to make sure are reflected in everything we do. And my particular interest is, as I said, through the specifications of the platform, because there is no messing around with specifications where a comma in the wrong place completely changes the meaning of every Java program. That is what I want us to be on top of, and I think we're pretty good at that, and people appreciate that when we meet them.
Well, Alex, I really appreciate the time. I will let you get back to that work, but thank you very much for being on the podcast.
Thank you, Chad.